The first thing people noticed about Douglas Whitmore's house was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of early mornings when frost still clung to the birch trees along the drive, when the lake lay perfectly still and the sky above Muskoka turned that particular shade of pale gold that made you believe, briefly, that everything in the world was fine. This was a different silence, the kind that had moved in after Douglas's wife died 3 years ago and simply never left. It settled into the hallways, pressed itself against the tall windows of the study, filled every room the way water fills a glass, completely, without asking. Douglas was 61 years old, the founder of Whitmore Capital, and one of the most quietly wealthy men in the Muskoka region. He had built his fortune carefully, the way a man builds a stone wall, one piece at a time, checking each one before setting it down. He had a boathouse worth more than most people's homes. He had a dock that stretched 30 meters into the lake. He had a housekeeper named Mrs. Burgess, who made excellent soup and terrible small talk, and a financial advisor named Lawrence who drove up from Toronto every quarter and always seemed slightly nervous. What Douglas did not have was anyone to eat breakfast with. He was sitting on the back deck one morning in late May, coffee going cold in his hand, watching a loon cross the water when he heard something unexpected. A child's voice, high and thin, carrying across the water with the particular clarity that Muskoka mornings seemed designed to amplify. He stood, shielded his eyes against the early light, and saw a small figure on the dock of the vacant property next door, the old Fenwick place that had sat empty since the previous autumn. The child was alone, sitting at the edge of the dock, feet dangling, talking to something in the water. From this distance, Douglas could see a mass of dark, curly hair and a pair of shoes that were at least 2 sizes too large. He almost went back inside. He almost picked up his coffee and went to his study and opened his laptop and read the morning briefing from Lawrence, which was what he normally did at this hour. Instead, he stood there and watched. The child reached into a plastic bag, pulled something out, and tossed it to the water. A piece of bread. The loon ignored it entirely, turned and glided away. The child watched it go, head tilting with an expression Douglas couldn't quite read from this distance, somewhere between disappointment and acceptance, the way a person looks when something fails to go their way, but they're not entirely surprised. He recognized that expression. He had worn it himself, rather a lot, these past 3 years. Her name was Juniper Lacasse, and she was 11 years old, and she had come to Muskoka because there was nowhere else to go. That wasn't entirely true. Her grandmother, who was 73 and lived in a small house on the outskirts of Gravenhurst, had taken her in after Juniper's mother entered the treatment program in Ottawa. But her grandmother's house had 3 rooms and a bad hip and a leaking roof over the back bedroom, which was now Juniper's room, and sometimes at night, Juniper lay under the damp spot on the ceiling and made lists of things she was grateful for, because her grade 5 teacher had told her once that gratitude was a practice, like a muscle, and Juniper was the sort of child who took that kind of advice seriously. Fenwick Dock was technically not hers to sit on, she knew that, but the property was empty, the lock on the gate was broken, and the dock extended out over water that was cleaner and deeper and more spectacularly beautiful than anything she had seen in the city. Her grandmother had told her she could walk anywhere along the lakefront as long as she was back before dark. Juniper took that permission seriously, too. She had been coming to the dock for 2 weeks before the man from the big house next door walked over and stood at the end of it and said, with the careful politeness of someone who doesn't often speak to children, "Are you all right out here?" Juniper looked up at him. He was tall, with gray at his temples and the kind of lines around his eyes that come from squinting into sun or from grief. She had seen both kinds on her mother's face, and she knew the difference. But she wasn't sure yet which kind this was. "I'm good," she said. "The Fenwicks don't. The property is unoccupied. I know. I'm not breaking anything." "No," he said. He looked out at the water. "You're not." He stood there a moment longer than seemed necessary. She waited the way she had learned to wait, still without filling the silence with nervous chatter. "I'm Douglas," he said finally. "Juniper, like the tree." "Like the tree," she confirmed. He nodded once, looked at the water again, and then went back to his house. Juniper watched him go. He walked the way people walk when they're used to walking alone, with the particular self-contained quality of someone who has stopped expecting company. She came back the next morning, and the one after that. On the fourth morning, he brought 2 cups of coffee to the end of his dock, set one down on the boards between them. It was tea, actually. He'd made a separate cup, and they sat in parallel silence while the sun came up over the eastern tree line and turned everything amber and impossible. "Do you fish?" he asked. "I never have. I could teach you, if you want." Juniper considered this the way she considered most things, seriously, without pretending it was less important than it was. "Okay," she said. Douglas's daughter-in-law had opinions about this arrangement. Her name was Renata, and she was 34, and she had been married to Douglas's son Philip for 6 years. And during that time she had developed a comprehensive set of opinions about most things. The best school districts in the GTA, the correct temperature for proofing bread dough, and what was best for Douglas. Renata drove up from Oakville on the 3rd weekend of June, ostensibly to check on the property and make sure Mrs. Burgess was managing, but Douglas had learned to read the subtext in his daughter-in-law's visits. She had called twice in the preceding week. She had asked both times how he was filling his time. He had told her about Juniper. There was a brief silence on the phone. Then, a child from next door, the property next door. "She's staying with her grandmother in Gravenhurst. She likes the dock. Douglas." A particular inflection. "You don't know anything about this girl. She's 11 years old and she likes herons." "That's not what I mean." He knew what she meant. She meant the same thing she always meant lately, which was that Douglas was not behaving the way a man of his standing ought to behave, that his grief had made him strange, that the correct response to losing one's wife was to join a board, or take up golf, or spend more time at the condo in Yorkville, not to befriend a child with oversized shoes on a neighbor's dock. When Renata arrived that Saturday, she brought Philip, which Douglas appreciated, and she brought a real estate brochure for a retirement community north of Barrie, which he appreciated less. She set it on the kitchen table without comment, in the way a person leaves something for someone else to notice at their own pace. He noticed. He did not comment. What he did instead was introduce her to Juniper, who arrived at 10 that morning, carrying a library book about freshwater fish and wearing the same oversized shoes. They were, Douglas had learned, her late grandfather's gardening shoes, kept because she liked the smell of the rubber, a detail that had lodged somewhere in his chest and stayed there. Renata looked at the child standing in Douglas's kitchen, and Juniper looked at Renata with her careful, measuring gaze, and the air between them was not exactly warm. "Your grandmother knows you're here?" Renata asked. "She knows I fish here on Saturdays," Juniper said. "Douglas catches things and I release them, Douglas, not Mr. Whitmore." Renata's eyebrows moved slightly. "She asked what I preferred," Douglas said. That evening, after Juniper had gone home and Mrs. Burgess had served dinner and Philip had eaten 2 helpings and said very little, Renata waited until the dishes were cleared and then said what she had come to say. "I think this is unhealthy, Douglas. You think a great deal of things are unhealthy. This child has a difficult home situation. Her mother is, you said, in treatment. She doesn't have a father in the picture. She's attaching to you." Renata folded her napkin with precise corners. "And I think you're allowing it because it fills a need that should be filled differently." "Which need?" "For company, for purpose, for—" She paused. "You, Miss Margaret, that's understandable, but this child is not a substitute for—" "For what?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. "For my wife? For the grandchildren I don't have yet? For what, exactly, is she a substitute?" Philip put his hand briefly on Douglas's arm. Renata's jaw tightened. "I only mean," she said carefully, "that you should think about appropriate limits." Douglas looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the morning 2 weeks ago when Juniper had arrived at the dock with a bruised knee from a bicycle fall, and she had shown it to him with the matter-of-fact candor of a child who did not expect anyone to make a fuss, and he had gone and got the first aid kit, and she had winced once and said, "Thank you." Douglas with a gravity that had nearly undone him. "I appreciate your concern," he said. "I'll keep it in mind." What Renata did not know, what Douglas himself only gradually understood, was that Juniper was not attaching to him out of need, or not only out of need. She was, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, one of the most self-possessed people he had ever met. She asked excellent questions and accepted incomplete answers with composure. She didn't perform emotions she wasn't having. She read 3 library books a week and had opinions about all of them. She also, in early July, told him that her grandmother's roof was leaking badly over the back bedroom and that the bucket she'd put there was full every morning. "Has she called someone about it?" Douglas asked. Juniper turned a fishing lure over in her hands, examining the hook. "She called Mr. Tessaro. He said he'd come in August." "August? She can't really." Juniper set the lure down. "It costs a lot." Douglas said nothing. He looked at the water. 3 days later, he sent a crew from a roofing company he trusted in Gravenhurst, and he paid for it, and he told Mrs. Burgess not to mention it. He was fairly certain Juniper's grandmother, whose name was Adeline, and who had the same careful dark eyes as her granddaughter, suspected anyway. She arrived at his dock one afternoon with a jar of wild blueberry jam and the particular dignified gratitude of someone who wants to say thank you without naming the thing they're thanking you for. And Douglas accepted the jam and offered her tea, and they sat on the deck for an hour and talked about the lake and the summer, and carefully about Juniper. "She's had a hard time," Adeline said. It was not a complaint, it was a fact stated plainly. "She seems remarkable," Douglas said. Adeline looked at him with those eyes. "She is," she said. She paused. "Not pity. She doesn't want pity. She never has." "No," he agreed. "She doesn't. She needs people who see her." Renata came back in late July, this time without Philip, which was a different signal. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Juniper was there, and the two of them sat on opposite sides of Douglas's kitchen in a configuration that reminded him uncomfortably of a hearing. Renata had brought documents. Not legal documents, not yet, but printed articles, studies, a printed email from someone named Dr. Fairweather, who was apparently a family therapist in Oakville. Renata laid these on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "I want to be clear that I'm raising this out of genuine concern," Renata said. "For both of you." Juniper looked at the papers, then at Douglas. Her expression was hard to read, but he knew her well enough now to see the careful stillness she deployed when something frightened her. "There's a pattern," Renata continued, "in cases where wealthy older adults form attachments to children from vulnerable backgrounds. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm saying there are risks, for Douglas's reputation, for the child's welfare, for Renata." Douglas's voice was level. "Stop." She stopped. "This child has a name. She's sitting in the room with us." He looked at Juniper. "You don't have to stay for this if you don't want to." Juniper lifted her chin slightly. "I want to stay." Renata's composure flickered. She had expected, Douglas thought, to have this conversation without Juniper present. She had timed her visit, for when she thought Juniper wouldn't be here, that she had gotten it wrong was a small miscalculation that cost her more than she knew. "Juniper," Renata said, making a visible effort to redirect. "I'm sure you understand that Douglas has a complicated family situation. There are concerns about how it looks. How it looks to who?" Juniper asked. Not hostile. Genuinely curious, in the way of a child who has never learned that some questions are not supposed to be asked. Renata blinked. "To people who? The community. His standing." "His standing," Juniper repeated. She looked at Douglas. "We fish," Douglas said to Renata. "We sit on the dock. We drink tea. I am not sure what, exactly, you believe is happening here, but I want you to say it plainly." Renata was quiet for a moment. Then, to her credit, something in her shifted. It was subtle, the way a held breath is released, or the way a person's shoulders drop when they concede something they've been fighting. She looked at Juniper, really looked, perhaps for the first time. Juniper looked back, patient, clear-eyed, waiting. "I'm sorry," Renata said finally. It came out smaller than she'd intended. I've been worried about Douglas. He's been very isolated since Margaret died, and I thought," she stopped. "I thought I was protecting him. He fishes every morning now," Juniper said, without particular emphasis. "He wasn't before." Renata looked at Douglas. He shrugged, which was the most he was willing to offer. "He eats breakfast," Juniper added. "He didn't used to, Mrs. Burgess told me." Douglas made a mental note to speak to Mrs. Burgess about professional discretion. The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Thursday morning in August without warning, the way real crises always do. Juniper was not on the dock. By 9 o'clock, when she was usually there, the dock was empty, and the morning was unusually quiet. Douglas told himself it was nothing. Children had other things to do. She was 11 years old, not under any obligation to appear. By 10 o'clock, he was standing on the dock watching the property line and feeling foolish. At 10:15, Adeline called his landline. Juniper had given her the number, which Douglas filed away as both touching and slightly alarming, and her voice was steady but very careful. She fell from the old cedar by the Fenwick property, Adeline said. She was trying to see the heron nest. She's hurt her arm. We're at the hospital in Gravenhurst. He was in his car before she finished the sentence. The break was clean, the doctor said. The radius, a simple fracture. She'd need a cast and rest, and no climbing for the remainder of the summer. Juniper sat on the hospital bed, with her arm in a temporary splint, still wearing the oversized gardening shoes, and she looked at Douglas when he came in with an expression that was trying very hard to be unconcerned, and not quite succeeding. I almost saw the nest, she said. I know. There were 3 chicks. I could just barely see them. Juniper. I know, she said, small. I know. He sat in the plastic chair beside the bed while Adeline spoke with the doctor. He looked at the child, this small, self-possessed, remarkable child with her grandfather's shoes and her library books, and her particular composure that wasn't armor so much as it was just how she was built. And he felt something settle in him that had been loose for 3 years. When you get your cast, he said, we can paint herons on it if you want. Mrs. Burgess is a decent artist. She'll never admit it, but she is. Juniper looked at the splint. Herons in flight or herons standing. Whichever you prefer. Both, she decided. Both, he agreed. Renata called that evening after Philip told her what had happened. She spoke to Douglas for 20 minutes, and then she asked if she could speak to Juniper. And Juniper, who had been installed on Douglas's couch, with a pillow and a stack of fresh library books, while Adeline went to retrieve things from the Gravenhurst house, took the phone with characteristic directness. Douglas did not listen to the conversation. He went to make tea, and then he stood in his kitchen for a while, looking out through the window at the lake, going gold, in the evening light, and he thought about Margaret, which he did every evening, and he thought about the first time she had laughed at something he'd said on their 3rd date, which was the moment he knew. He thought about the way certain things ended, and the way other things, unexpectedly, began. When he came back with the tea, Juniper handed him the phone and picked up her book. She said she's sorry, Juniper told him, without looking up. For what specifically? For the papers. She said she was scared, and she didn't know how to say that, so she said something else instead. Juniper turned to Paige. I told her that happens to people sometimes. Douglas set the tea on the side table. That was generous of you. She loves you, Juniper said, still reading. She just doesn't know how to show it without making a strategy. He sat across from her. Outside, the loon crossed the water one more time, its call, lifting and descending in that long falling note that belonged only to this lake, to this hour, to the particular quality of summer evenings in Muskoka that Margaret had loved and that Douglas had not been able to fully appreciate until recently, without her. Juniper, he said. I want to talk to you and your grandmother about something. She looked up from her book, waiting. I've been speaking with some people at the Gravenhurst School. There's an arts program I can't afford. I know. I'm not asking you to. He paused. I'd like to help with your school, and I'd like your grandmother's roof to be properly insulated before winter, not just patched. And I'd like... He stopped himself, recalibrated. I'm not trying to replace anything. I know what you have, and I know what you've lost, and I'm not trying to be something I'm not. But I think you're someone the world should invest in, and I happen to be in a position to make some investments. Juniper looked at him for a long time. He had learned over the summer to let her look. She thought before she spoke, this child. Always. You'd have to ask Grandma Adeline, she said finally. I intend to, and it can't be like charity. She said the word carefully, not as an insult, more as a specification. She won't accept it if it feels like charity. It won't. It's an investment. Those have terms and expectations. What are the terms? That you keep fishing on Saturdays, he said. And that you tell me what happens at the end of every book you read. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile yet, more like the precursor to one, the moment before sunrise when the sky changes color, and you know what's coming even though it hasn't arrived. Those are good terms, she said. The cast came off in September. Mrs. Burgess did paint herons on it. Herons in flight on one side, herons standing at the edge of the water on the other, done in careful blues and grays, and when the cast came off, Juniper brought it to show Douglas and they propped it on the windowsill of the study like a piece of art, which Douglas's assistant Miriam found baffling, and which Philip, on his next visit, examined for a long time without saying anything. Adeline, Lacasse, and Douglas spoke for 2 hours one Saturday afternoon while Juniper was at the dock. They spoke about the school program, and about the winter, and about what it meant to give and receive without diminishing either person. Adeline was sharp and kind, and did not let him off easy, and he respected her enormously for it. They came to an arrangement that satisfied both of them, which is the only kind of arrangement worth making. Renata came back in October, this time to help Douglas replace the boathouse windows before the season changed. She brought Philip and a case of good Ontario wine, and she sat on the deck with Juniper one afternoon and asked about the library books, and Juniper told her, at some length, about the one she'd just finished. A novel about a girl who crossed the Atlantic solo on a homemade raft. And Renata listened with the particular focused attention of someone who is trying to understand rather than just waiting for their turn to speak, which was, Douglas thought, perhaps the most important thing a person could learn to do. The lake turned dark in October, and the birch trees went gold, and the silence that had lived in Douglas's house for 3 years did not disappear exactly. He wasn't sure it would ever disappear completely, nor was he sure it should. Margaret was worth grieving. She was worth the silence. But there was other sound in it now. The particular knock of small fists on the front door at 8:45 on Saturday mornings, the sound of a library book set on the kitchen table, the particular quality of conversation with a person who says exactly what they mean and means exactly what they say, and is still young enough to find the world interesting rather than merely exhausting. On the last morning before Juniper and Adeline drove back to the city for the school year, Juniper sat on the Fenwick dock one final time. The property had been sold over the summer to a family from Mississauga who would arrive next June, and the dock would be theirs, and this was the last morning it was simply empty and hers. Douglas sat beside her. The lake was still. 2 loons in the far distance. Same terms next summer? She asked. Same terms, he said. She nodded as though this settled something. She picked up a flat stone from the boards between them. She'd been collecting them all summer, smooth gray lake stones, and turned it over in her hands once, and then she set it in Douglas's palm without comment, the way you give someone something you want them to keep. He folded his fingers around it. The sun came up over the tree line and turned the whole lake gold, and the loons crossed the water, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said.